In 1979, Dade County, Florida police officer W.C. Christian officially reported that Filiberto Cardenas had had a close encounter of the third kind. This was written directly onto the police report. Cardenas claimed that he had been abducted and taken to an alien base deep within the Earth's ocean. This is his story. Welcome to Rope, Reports of Paranormal Events. Here, all we do is share information on established mysteries of the world. We don't do hearsay, and we don't fabricate anything. If you've heard it here on our channel, then there is evidence for it out in the world. And this report begins with a pig. Or actually, the lack thereof. A man named Fernando Marti and his wife, Mirta, were planning to have an upcoming celebration, and they wanted roasted pig to be the main course. The only problem was they didn't have a pig, and they didn't have a vehicle that was large enough to transport one. So they called a friend, Filiberto Cardenas. Filiberto was a local business owner, and he was a pillar of the community. But more importantly, at least for this situation, Filiberto had a station wagon, and the station wagon was large enough to transport a pig. And he was happy to help. It was Wednesday, January 3rd, 1979. Filiberto was working at his gift shop when the call came in. And he told his friend Fernando to just come by later that afternoon and he would help him get his pig. Shortly after that, Fernando and Mirta and their 13-year-old daughter, Isabel, arrived at the gift shop. Then the four of them got into Filiberto's 1970 Chevrolet station wagon and headed to one of the farms just outside of town. Unfortunately, when they got to the farm, the farmer told them that because the holidays had just passed, he had sold all of his pigs. So everyone got back into the car and they went to another farm, where they were told the same thing. Disappointed, but not quite ready to give up, they decided to try one last farm before heading back to town. When they pulled up to Jose Hernandez's place, they were excited because the sign out front read, "Pigs for sale." But when Mr. Hernandez came out to greet them, he told them that he was very sorry, but he had just sold his very last pig right before they arrived. By this time, it was a little past 6 p.m., and at this time of the year, the sun had already set, and it was too late to try another farm. So they headed back to town, and that is when it happened. Filiberto and Fernando were sitting in the front seat, and Mirta and Isabel, her daughter, were sitting in the back. They were on Highway 27, heading toward Hialeah. And this area of Highway 27, also known as Okeechobee Road, was an open highway and was surrounded by fields. The car was rolling smoothly down the road when all of a sudden, the engine began to sputter. At first, Fernando thought, well, maybe the car was out of gas. But Filiberto assured him that no, they had plenty of gas. So they just kept driving. But the sputtering got worse, and before long, the engine died, and the car silently rolled to a stop. Not only had the engine died, but all of the electrical had went out as well. The headlights went dark, and the radio fell silent. And they were still quite a ways from town, out in the middle of nowhere, really, without even another car anywhere in sight. Everything was dark, and the sounds of crickets actually rushed into the cabin as Filiberto and Fernando cracked open their doors. Mirta and Isabel waited as the two men got out and popped the hood. They looked over the engine and they checked the electrical systems, but nothing seemed like it was out of place. Fernando actually knew a good bit about cars, and he just couldn't make any sense of it. There wasn't a single thing that made him think that the car should act this way. It was as if the car had died for no reason at all. And then, check this out. Multicolored lights began bouncing, reflecting off of the engine, indicating, of course, that someone or something was behind the two men, flashing some sort of a light at the car. Now, at the same time that they saw these lights reflecting off of the engine, they also heard a loud, terrifying buzzing sound. Fernando reported the experience like this.
At that moment, the engine began to reflect different colors: red, violet, blue, orange, and then a bluish white. And there was also a sound like thousands of bees swarming all around us.
Now, before either man could turn around to see what was causing these lights and making this horrible buzzing sound, the car, this 3,000-pound car, began to shake. And inside the car, Mirta and Isabel started crying. Filiberto stepped back from the car, intending to turn around, when all of a sudden, he became paralyzed, and he couldn't complete his turn. He was just standing there, frozen, unable to move. And then, check this out. His shoes left the pavement, and he began to float upward weightlessly. Now, at the same time, his friend Fernando had been leaning over the engine underneath the hood, and he too felt himself become weightless. But because he was still up under the hood, he was able to grab onto something in the engine and hold on for dear life. And that is Amy calling. Amy is this channel's researcher. All of the information on this channel comes from Amy. So if she's calling, we're definitely gonna take this call. Amy, you're on.
Hey, I just wanted to call and add a little information to the report. First of all, your report is spot on, but I wanted to amplify something about this scene. The car started shaking violently. It was so violent, it was actually bouncing. And the girls inside, they weren't just crying. They were screaming hysterically. I wanted to point this out because I was actually in a car that was almost sucked up into a tornado. And this scene reminded me of that. It had to be insanely scary for those girls.
Wow. Okay, cool. So you're saying that the car was bouncing violently, and so the girls were screaming hysterically.
Exactly. And you're doing a great job. This story is really compelling. I'll check back in with you a bit later.
Thank you. As I said, Amy is this channel's researcher. She's more than intelligent. She's the powerhouse behind the stuff we find to put on this channel. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, and you'll find out sooner or later. She's the absolute love of my life. We're actually getting married next month, and I'm super jazzed about that. All right, so back to the story. So Filiberto couldn't move, and he was still rising up into the sky.
I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, unable to do anything. I could hear the screams of the woman in the car. I looked down and saw that I was suspended in the air and rising. When I was about 8 or 10 feet above the car, everything went dark, and I don't remember what happened.
Fernando, who was still under the hood, holding on for dear life, heard Filiberto behind him screaming, "Let me go, let me go." And then Filiberto's screams just stopped. Now, at some point, Fernando was able to turn his head just a bit, and he was able to see what was happening. His friend, Filiberto, was floating up, and then he disappeared into a large cigar-shaped object that was hovering just above the car. And a moment later, this cigar-shaped object just pulled away and vanished into the dark. Immediately after this large object took Filiberto, Fernando felt the pull of gravity again. His legs dropped and the soles of his shoes touched the pavement. At that point, reality rushed in, and he heard his wife and his daughter screaming from inside of the car. He took just a second, and he made sure that if he let go, he wasn't going to float away. And when he was positive, he released his grip and rushed to the cabin of the car and comforted the girls. Once he was sure that they were all right, he jumped into the driver's seat and cranked the engine. And all the while, he was shouting, "They took Filiberto! They took Filiberto!" At first, the car did not want to start, but after about the third try, it turned over, and a minute later, they were rolling down the highway, heading back to town. And at that moment, everything felt surreal. The night was extremely dark, and the highway was still empty. Theirs was the only car on the road. And inside of the car, the girls' whimpers were fading. And Fernando had no idea how he was going to deal with the situation and what he was going to do next. His first instinct, of course, was to call the police. But then he thought, what was he going to say? That some alien spaceship came down and sucked his friend up into the sky? And worse, what if Filiberto never came back? Well, then they would suspect that Fernando had something to do with his friend's disappearance and probably killed him. Eventually, Fernando would go on trial for murder. Nevertheless, this was his friend, so he stopped at the very first gas station that he came to that had a payphone, and he called the police. The lady on the other end of the line said that she couldn't verify the address that he was calling from, and that he either needed to call back from a residential line that could be traced, or just come into the police station. So Fernando hung up, and then he called Filiberto's wife, Iris. Now, try to put yourself into the situation. Here's Fernando. He just witnessed something that most of us only ever hear about, and if the truth be told, probably don't even really believe is possible. And being there during something like that has got to be more than nerve-wracking. So he was frantic, and this phone call to Filiberto's wife was confusing. Fernando was so upset, and he was talking so fast that she couldn't quite understand what he was trying to tell her. They were out on the highway with car problems. There were different colored lights. Filiberto was in danger. Filiberto was gone. By the time that he hung up, Iris thought that they had ran a red light or something, and they had gotten into a serious wreck, and Filiberto was either dead or seriously injured. So she immediately grabbed her keys, jumped into her car, and then took off in their direction. After Fernando hung up, he got back into the station wagon and then headed toward the police station. And just as he was entering the town limits, he saw a police cruiser stopped across the street in a commercial zone. So he pulled up alongside of the officer and he started to explain frantically what had just happened to his friend. And as he was going a mile a minute, confusing this poor police officer, Iris, who was already out on her way to where she thought the accident was, saw the station wagon sitting alongside of this police car. So she immediately pulled up, crying, asking about her husband. Meanwhile, her husband was on board of this spaceship, and he was about to have his skull pricked with 1,000 tiny needles, and his mind read. The last thing that Filiberto remembered before everything went black was looking at the engine and then stepping backward and feeling weightless and paralyzed. As he floated upward helplessly, he was completely overcome with terror. And after he got about 10 feet off of the ground, everything went black. When he woke up, he was sitting in a strange seat that held him in place without any visible restraints, almost like he was still paralyzed. He was stuck to the chair by some invisible force. His arms and his hands were locked down, and his legs were locked down too. He could look around, but that was about it. He saw that he was in a small room, and there were 3 other beings with him. 2 very alien in appearance, and one that he said looked more human than the others. But this more human-looking being was actually acting more robotic than human, which was very strange and a very terrifying thing to watch. The only other human in the room was a robot. He said that these beings all stood just under 5 foot tall, and they were all wearing tight-fitting bluish-white uniforms with an insignia on the right side of the upper chest. As he sat there, unable to move, one of the beings came over to him carrying what looked like a helmet with 1,000 tiny needles on the inside. Filiberto tried to resist, but they managed to get the helmet onto his head, and these needles all bit into his skull. But once the helmet was on, one of the beings stood in front of him and spoke to him. But Filiberto didn't understand. He later said that it sounded maybe like German. So this individual rotated a dial and then spoke again. This time, it sounded like the alien was speaking English. And Filiberto figured out that they were trying to communicate with him. So he indicated that he still couldn't understand. Then the alien rotated the dial again and spoke once more. Filiberto said that this time it was in Spanish, which he could understand, but it was like with a Portuguese or an Italian accent, so he had to pay close attention and listen very carefully. Once they were able to communicate with him, one of the very first things they told him was that everything was going to be okay and that all was love. And during this entire experience, they just kept repeating that, speaking about this universal love and happiness. Maybe a ploy to keep him calm, or maybe aliens just love everybody. Filiberto said that as he was sitting there in this room, he couldn't see outside, but he could feel inertia, and he thought that they were probably moving at a great speed. Once they had established communication, and they told him that all was love, and they saw that he was calm, they released his restraints. And then they took him into another room. And at the front of this room stood a being that Filiberto said looked very human. Filiberto said he felt like this being was the leader. And as soon as Filiberto was situated in the very center of this room, the being began communicating with him. Filiberto described the scene like this. This supreme being was up front on like a stage, and a bright light was shining from behind him, which made it very difficult for Filiberto to see this individual's face very clearly. The being spoke telepathically with images and in perfect Spanish, and as he spoke, the entire room turned into some type of giant projector where the walls displayed images of what the alien was talking about. This majestic being spoke of the past, of the present, and of the future. He said that, check this out, sexual organs had a higher spiritual purpose than what we humans use them for. He said that earthlings needed a new religion. And he talked about California falling off into the ocean, and a multitude of other things that really didn't seem to make much sense. But he did say one thing that stood out, at least to me. He said that 6 people who had been abducted earlier would one day be returned to the earth with a great message for all of mankind. And that is my researcher calling again. Hey, Amy, you're on.
Real quick, I just wanted to say that when I was researching this event, this part really reminded me of the Al Bender case. As a matter of fact, it was almost identical.
That's right. That happened in the 1950s, right?
Yeah, there's quite a few similarities with that case and this one. Al Bender was also taken aboard an alien ship, and he was also taken into a large room where there was a majestic being on stage giving him all sorts of information, just like with this case. And just like with this case, the aliens also took Al Bender to a base deep inside the earth.
Hey, wait just 1 minute. We haven't gotten to that part yet, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't heard that part of the case yet.
Oh, oops, okay. Sorry, I'll let you go.
Okay, goodbye. She's right, though. There are a lot of similarities between this case and the Al Bender case. If you haven't heard of the Al Bender case and you'd like us to put together a report on it, drop me a comment below and we might put something together for you. After this supreme being was finished sharing all of these fantastic things with Filiberto, he was then taken into a smaller room and he was placed in another chair, and he was once again held down with some invisible restraints. Then, one of the aliens got behind some sort of a control panel, and a few moments later, Filiberto said that he felt the room detach from the rest of the ship, and either a view screen appeared directly in front of his face, or he can actually see right through the front wall of the craft. Either way, he watched as the outside world raced past him. In the book, UFO Abduction Undersea, author and doctor Virgilio Sanchez-Ocejo created this illustration demonstrating the experience. And like my researcher just shared with us a moment ago, Filiberto said that they were descending, not ascending. They were heading directly toward the ocean at a high rate of speed. And a few moments later, they landed on a stretch of beach. And then the alien who was operating the craft shined something toward one of the large rocks at the very edge of the water. And then, get this, part of the rock just dematerialized, revealing a tunnel that went down into the earth toward the ocean. The ship then entered this tunnel, and once again, it picked up speed. Filiberto said that they were going so fast that all he could see was massive amounts of water racing past them. And they were dropping deeper and deeper into the ocean. He said that he could feel the vibration of the ship, and then he sensed that they veered to the right. And shortly after that, the ship began to slow down. And finally, once the ship was going slow enough, Filiberto said that he could see that they were indeed in a tunnel deep within the ocean. He said that the walls were phosphorescent, and it was a very unique experience. And then, a few moments later, the craft came to a stop inside this huge underground cavern with hundreds of beings walking around. Filiberto said that right away, he noticed that there was a symbol everywhere. First, he saw one very big one in a prominent location that was, as Filiberto described it, as tall as a street lamp, and where everyone could see it. And all of the rest were on everyone's shirts, like insignias on the right side of their upper chest. And the symbol? It was of an animal. It was of an animal that's been strongly associated with the devil. When the craft that Filiberto was in finally came to a stop, he found himself in a large cavern with alien beings everywhere, and every one of them was wearing this symbol on their shirts. It was a symbol of a serpent wrapped around a cross. When Amy was sharing this part with me, I honestly got chills, and I instantly thought of the Phil Schneider case. He's the man who said that he had experiences with what he called the Draco, who supposedly live underground, deep within the earth, and control everything on this planet. I also thought of the many ancient cultures who worship the serpent god, and I couldn't help but wonder, if this story is true, could there be any sort of connection there? At first, all of the beings that Filiberto saw were alien. But then, a huge door the size of a wall opened up, and on the other side of this wall was a multitude more beings, and many of them, get this, were human. Now, at this point, Filiberto had just disembarked from this craft, and he was allowed to walk around freely in this large cavern with this mixture of aliens and humans moving about all around him. And as he was standing there, in the midst of this, taking all of this in, one of the humans came up to him and welcomed him. Filiberto said that this person was a man from South America, and this person spoke perfect Spanish, and in Filiberto's dialect. He told Filiberto that he and several other individuals, humans, had been working with these aliens for a very long time. Filiberto's experience in this underground alien city was extremely long, and he said that it felt as if this whole thing had taken many months, but when in actuality, as we'll soon find out, it really only took a couple of hours. And this report really isn't long enough to go over every tiny detail of what happened to Filiberto. But a few of the takeaways are these. At one point, these aliens strapped Filiberto down to a surgical table, and then they poked, prodded, and examined every part of his body. He said that that was not a pleasant experience at all. And at another time, he was taken into another one of those majestic rooms, like the one he had been on board that ship. And here, an alien overlord showed him a three-dimensional map of the Earth. And check this out. The alien indicated and zoomed in on 3 alien bases, the size of cities. One was deep within the Atlantic Ocean, one was in the Pacific Ocean, and one was deep within the Earth. Filiberto was told that these aliens have been here for thousands of years. To make a long story short, at the end of this crazy alien adventure, these alien beings finally put Filiberto into another ship and then brought him back to the area that they had scooped him up from. Well, not exactly the same area. They actually dropped him off in a field about 15 miles away from where they had picked him up. And they must have drugged him or something before they left, because Filiberto said that he remembered watching their ship take off and disappear into the night. But all the while, he said he felt as if he were completely disoriented. And then, check this out. A moment later, somehow, he was no longer in the field, but he was on an open highway, and he was on all fours, and he was looking up at the headlights of a quickly approaching car. While all of this was happening to Filiberto, his friends, who had watched him get sucked up into the sky, and his wife, Iris, were at the police station filling out a missing persons report. One can only imagine and how crazy they must have sounded, but they all agreed that they would tell the truth. And the police station? They issued a be on the lookout for, and they gave Filiberto's description. Now, all of this took a while to do. From the time that Fernando saw Filiberto being abducted and taken into that cigar-shaped object, to the time that everyone got to the police station and the report was filed, took a little over 2 hours. And just as they were sending out this be on the lookout for, an adjacent police station announced that they had just picked up this guy on a highway who appeared to be drugged, and he matched Filiberto's description. So police officers came to Fernando and to Iris, and they asked, could this be your guy? Well, the family drove over to the other police station, and lo and behold, it was indeed Filiberto. To make a long story short, the family was reunited, and now Filiberto had this bizarre tale to tell. And although this story seems absolutely crazy, believe it or not, the most insane part hadn't even happened yet. Up until the date of this very report, I, the channel's commentator, Damon, never heard of an alien abduction where the abductee communicated with his alien abductors after the incident had taken place, asking them if he could be abducted just one more time, and if this time he could bring a friend. On Wednesday, February 21st, 1979, Filiberto and his wife Iris went out to where Filiberto had been abducted the first time, and they were hoping that the aliens would return and scoop them both up so that he could introduce his wife to his new alien friends. See, after his experience just a month earlier, Filiberto somehow was telepathically connected to these aliens, and he was able to converse with them in his mind, and he had several conversations with them. And in one of these conversations, he asked them, in his mind, if they would be willing to come back and abduct him and his wife, and they agreed. According to the couple, it was just a little past 5 a.m. when an extraterrestrial spaceship appeared in the sky not far from where Filiberto and Iris were standing. The ship slowly made its way over to the couple and then lowered itself toward the ground. When it was just about a foot off of the ground, it stopped. Iris said that it never did touch the earth. Then a ramp extended toward the couple, and they boarded the ship. Interestingly, Iris said that as they entered the ship, they passed through some sort of invisible barrier. She described it like this.
We walked up a ramp and could see inside. Then I had a sensation that my body passed through a transparent material, like a glass. I felt like I was going to collide with it, but instead I passed through it. After I passed through it, I felt a distinct atmospheric change, like we entered a different world. I felt myself floating. I felt like my body did not weigh anything. When I looked back outside through the door, it seemed as if there was a division between two worlds. It was very distinct and separate.
When we were putting this report together, we really wanted to provide great imagery of what these alien creatures look like. And Iris, she actually gave a really good description of these aliens. She said that they all wore the same tight-fitting reflective clothing, and they were all just a little shorter than Filiberto. She said that their suits covered their entire bodies, hands and feet, only leaving a small opening where their face was.
The suit covered the entire body and came down covering half of the forehead. On the right side of the head, where the ear should be, I had a bulge in the suit, like a single headphone. But inside the suit, From the nape of the neck to the bottom of the back, near the waist, they have 5 cables. Besides this, they had other controls on the chest of their suits. Their faces looked human, but their eyes were elongated. I could not see any eyebrows. Their noses were small and flat. Their mouths were large and long, and their lips were very thin, almost not there. On the suit, on the right breast, they have a symbol of a serpent.
At one point, Iris asked them why they had chosen Filiberto. And they told her that, well, there was no particular reason, that they had just picked him up at random. Had he not been out in that area looking for that pig that night, he never would have been taken. They said that right now, all they were doing was choosing individuals so that they could learn how not to scare humans. Because one day, they were planning on revealing themselves to millions. And when that day comes, they don't want any of us to be afraid. And then they told Iris something that I thought was fairly interesting. They said that in 1993, humans would make contact with other planets outside of our solar system. We would see the life and the advancements of other planets. Now, although this did not happen, before the 1990s, we weren't even sure that there were any planets outside of our solar system orbiting other stars for intelligent beings to even exist on. But in 1992, in January, Alexander Wolfshan and Dale Frail were the very first to announce the existence of exoplanets, planets that were outside our solar system. This second abduction took just about an hour, and then the couple was returned to their vehicle. When they arrived at home, Filiberto called a friend, and he left a message on his friend's answering machine. He said that he had been abducted again, and for some reason, the aliens told him not to give out any details until after 10 a.m. Then he hung up the phone. Check this out. Just a few hours later, right at 10 a.m. on February 21st, 1979, a large unidentified object was seen by hundreds floating just above Miami's International Airport. This story is extremely fascinating. Aliens that live underground and have been on Earth controlling things for millennia. An abduction where predictions of the future are made, and where a man is permitted to return with his wife after being abducted. But how much of this story is true? Well, this is a very tangled tale. And in an attempt to keep it interesting, of course, we did not put every single detail of this story into the report. Some of the things that we left out seem to contradict this story just a bit. One of the things was that at one point, Iris said that the aliens told her that they're not into suppressing the memory of abductees, that abductees are absolutely free to tell their tale. But when Filiberto was first picked up, he had absolutely no memory of what had just transpired, and he couldn't even give an account of where he had been for the last 2 hours. His last memory was of becoming weightless and then floating up into that ship and losing consciousness. And that's what he told the police officers when they got him back to the police station. And he must have sounded convincing about that part, though, because written on the official police report was close encounter of the third kind. Later, some supervisor must have seen that and thought better of it because it was crossed off. But the point is that initially, Filiberto had no memory, and only after 4 hypnotic regressions did his story come to light. So when Iris said that aliens don't suppress the abductee's memory, well, that didn't quite jive with what happened to Filiberto. Also, the prediction that humans would discover other intelligent beings in the universe in 1993, that didn't jive either. I do think that it was very interesting that we discovered exoplanets in 92, but that is definitely not the same thing. I don't know what happened to Filiberto, but I personally just can't accept this account, at least not as it's told by him and his wife, not at this point. But that doesn't mean that I think that nothing happened. Not at all. Fernando, Myrta, and their daughter Isabel were there when Filiberto was sucked up into that cigar-shaped ship. And to this day, they've never changed their story. And Isabel, she was only 13 years old when this happened. Also, hundreds of people saw that unidentified object hovering over Miami's International Airport that morning, right at 10 a.m., the time that Filiberto and Iris said that the aliens asked them to keep quiet, hush hush, until it seemingly demonstrated the existence of aliens beforehand. But you know, this story really makes me wonder, was it aliens? Or could it have been the government? This whole story reminds me of Project Mirage. If you've never heard of Project Mirage, it is fascinating. In the 1950s, the CIA worked with several countries all over the world to fake alien abductions for some nefarious reason. Later, a whistleblower who was deep in the middle of all this came forward and blew the lid off of the entire thing. We did a complete report on this, and if you'd like to see it, it's here. We're so glad that you checked out our show. I'm Damon, the channel's commentator.
And I'm Amy, the channel's researcher. We hope you join us for future episodes.
And with that, well, I guess that ties it up for another report of the paranormal here on Rope.
Thank you.